Yes. Hello, Tyler. Thank you very much for making it today on my show. It's so great to see you again. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's good to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. And I know today is going to be a very valuable talk because the fact that, you are a wandering therapist.
That's right.
Somebody who's obviously dealt with probably hundreds or thousands of trauma, I'd say patients or clients even.
Yep.
And obviously, you're in this work, and I just feel that in this day and age now, everybody needs some sort of therapy.
It feels that way. I mean, we live in a world that is full of trauma, so it's not just about a profession, but it's also personal life too. We definitely all have our own traumas that we're working through, and I think that's how we get a chance really ultimately to learn, even though it comes through pain sometimes.
It does, yeah. And I always find that with pain, comes spirituality. With pain comes just wisdom and just life experience. And even though pain might be termed as a negative thing, for me, I see it as growth, right?
Right. I try to distinguish it with my clients sometimes that there's a difference between pain and suffering, and that pain is truly actually one of our greatest learning tools, and it's necessary, it's unavoidable in our lives. But suffering is our choice as to how we're going to deal with the pain. And that gives us that opportunity to either learn and grow or to go in deeper into our own misery and our own struggle.
That's so true. That's so true. And so tell us about yourself, Tyler. I know that my listeners will be very keen to understand about your history, who you are and where you are today.
Great, you bet. So yeah, I'm a marriage and family therapist. I live in Logan, Utah in the United States. And I've been operating my own practice for just over 10 or 11 years. And I focus specifically on betrayal trauma, addictions, and then of course, when you work with addictions, it becomes a lot of work around other forms of trauma and shame. And so that's kind of what I specialize in. And the reason that I've kind of come to that place is largely because of my own life experience with some significant trauma in my own life, overcoming my own forms of addiction, and then working really hard to try to overcome some of the betrayal that I had caused in my own marriage with my wife several years ago. Probably that was about 10 or 11 years ago that all happened. So it's a personal story as much as it is a professional story, and I try to use my personal story to help my clients who are going through similar things.
Yeah, and that's really powerful, especially coming from just authenticity, and that's what I can sense from you. You're just highly authentic and honest. I don't really sense any ego, because I know ego has a big part to play when it comes to trauma survivors and anybody who is trying to hide something which is deep down inside. And I just think that when you can let go of the ego, that's when your authenticity flows. And I can imagine that it's been a very fulfilling yet probably tough journey that you've been on to get to.
Yeah, it's funny that you talk about ego, because if you were to talk to my wife, she'd say I got plenty of ego left, right? But with that, there's also some truth to what you're saying, that I think one of the ways that we start to break through our own ego, the thing that gets in the way of our own progress, is to go through those hard things. Because when you're broken and what I mean by that in good, humble, good ways, it allows us to lay down those defenses that we typically put up. And that's where our learning starts to happen. And that's where the growth starts to happen. And sometimes the best way to lay down the ego is the actual challenge and the struggle itself.
Yeah, that's so true. And so obviously, you talk about your own journey of trauma. Did it start from when you were quite young?
Yeah. So for me, I mean, there's all of these different things that we can be traumatized by, right? So sometimes there are things that are just ways that we're raised that we don't even realize, but they're just normal things. And then there's also some significant, big kinds of traumas that happen in our lives sometimes. And so I was raised in a really good home. I have parents who love me. I have parents who try to take care of me, a very religious home. And that religious background was really good in some ways, but it was also really hard in some ways because there were expectations that were inherently placed that I felt a lot of pressure to perform. And that pressure led to me feeling like I couldn't show certain parts of myself, my weaknesses, and I felt like I was a hypocrite all the time. And then around the time that I was actually in high school, about my sophomore year in high school, which would have put me around age 16, I had a really traumatizing experience where I witnessed, actually almost felt responsible for the death of one of my best friends. And in the aftermath of that, I started to have two things happen. One was that I started to feel responsible, and I felt a ton of shame about who I was and that I was at fault for things. And then I got into coping in certain ways that weren't healthy, where I got depressed and I turned to certain things to try to cope that weren't healthy for me. But on the other side, I started to get help, and I got help from good therapists and good church leaders, and my parents started to step in, and I started to realize that, you know, maybe my life experience was actually going to be something that could help people in the future, as much as I was still struggling, trying to overcome all of my own demons and my own struggles. And that started to wrestle for a while until about the third year of my marriage, which would have been about 10 years later, when everything broke loose and all of my secrets ended up coming out. And that's where I was finally able to lay down all of the things that were keeping me stuck and really confront those traumas that had started early on in life, but had never been fully addressed.
Oh, wow. So, and it sounds as though from whatever you recovered, it obviously came back to you, because it always does. I always find this with any kind of trauma survivor, even though, you know, they might have felt like they've healed, suddenly something will trigger them again. Especially for me, I mean, you know, I'm talking from my own experience here, is that, you know, as soon as I had a child, all of my traumas seemed to have come back, and I felt like I was back to stage one.
Yeah.
And I was having to go through the whole processes again, going through a divorce, you know, like a bit of depression again. And that's when I decided to write, and that really helped me to heal. So it's interesting. I don't know, do you believe that trauma does happen in cycles? Does it?
Yeah, there's a really phenomenal book that I refer my clients to for those who have, you know, trying to overcome childhood sexual abuse, called Healing the Wounded Heart. And one of the premises inside that book is that once we start to have certain traumatic events in our lives, without really knowing it, we end up having what he calls reenactments of those same traumas. So if I was traumatized in a certain sense where I was betrayed by somebody as a young child, eventually what I'm going to start to see in my life is I'm going to find all the other ways where that betrayal continues to happen, and that trigger comes up, right? Yeah. And the crazy thing is that the littlest things, even the things that we don't even know, could be triggering to us. And so I can feel like I've put my trauma away. Like, here, I'll give you an example of one of my clients where she was abused as a child growing up really significantly. And then she came into my office as an adult, and she said, I'm having terrible nightmares. I can't sleep at night. I feel like I'm being re-traumatized when I go to bed at night, but I don't know what it's about. And we started to kind of explore what had happened. And her relationship was at the time safe, and she was being successful at her work. And finally, what it came down to is that when she went to bed at night, the smoke alarm in her house had a blinking red light. And what she realized is that when she was being abused as a child, she would focus on the red light that was blinking on her clock while the abuse was happening to dissociate and to try to cope. And that the red light and the smoke alarm was bringing out that same response in her body. And that's what trauma does, is it remembers things. So we could be listening to a song, or we could have a certain thought go through our head, or somebody could say a certain phrase, and instantly we're back in that same experience of trauma, even though we think we put it away. Because the brain and the body are just looking for ways to protect itself, right?
Yeah. And I guess that's a sign of PTSD as well, right? Flashbacks.
Yeah, exactly. That's part of what flashbacks are. Is the brain is basically still in the process of trying to organize all of that information, but it's never quite able to. So then it keeps coming up, trying to protect itself, right?
Yeah. So what, like, regarding your own experience, what is the solution for this? How does one overcome these flashbacks and come out of the trauma cycle and break free?
Those are great questions. I can kind of I'll tell you from a personal and a professional place, if that's okay. So
yeah, sure.
The journey for me has been, I think number one is we should see it as a process. So it's not going to be a one-time therapy session. It's not going to be an instant fix. It's going to be an ongoing process where I learn to physically ground myself. I learn how to build a team of support that I can talk to and share some of the things that I feel like I'm never going to be able to talk about. And that's scary for us.
Yeah.
And then I have to go to work on actually looking at how the trauma has affected my belief systems about myself and about relationships. And I have to start challenging those beliefs and inserting what I would call the truth. Mm-hmm. So for me, I always felt unworthy. I felt like I wasn't good enough. I felt like things were always my fault. I felt like I was never going to measure up. And when I started to learn that maybe those were lies that I had listened to and believed, but they didn't have to be true, then I went to work on self-compassion. I went to work on connection with other people. And then I went to work on something that we call dailies, which is living a life that's pursuing connection and growth instead of living a life of trying to hide. And then the last part of it for me, if we're looking for something practical, is I'm a big fan of EMDR as a form of trauma treatment, and I'm sure that's really familiar with a lot of your listeners as well. But EMDR was life-changing for me, and I see a lot of help in my clients that I work with doing EMDR as well.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it is. I mean, and that's something that I've been looking into as well, because it's a very skillful technique to actually cure. Well, would you say it actually cures the trauma, because you're in there, aren't you, and you're in there actually fighting it rather than just disguising it or just trying to dismiss it? Because I don't know, for me, that there's only so much amount of talking therapy that I could do. I needed healing. I needed like real like spiritual techniques, like the EFT, hypnotherapy. I literally did a decade of just healing.
Yeah, sure.
And that really helps. And, I'm still on this journey. But because obviously, you also mentioned about the fear cycle. Again, this is the first time I've ever heard about this. So it'd be great to kind of gain your understanding of that.
Sure. Yeah, you bet. So some people call it the trauma cycle, or in our practice here, we call it the fear cycle. And what it consists of is basically this idea that we're always walking on eggshells after trauma. We grow these really long antennae that kind of like look for any potential dangers that might cause us to be traumatized again. And then we start to shrink away from all of those things. And we actually create our own prison cell for a living by doing that. So what ends up happening is that the fear cycle happens where I start to see things as triggers. Those triggers scare me, and it puts me on an emotional roller coaster. And so when I'm on that emotional roller coaster, I'm trying to look for safety and stability. And so I'm obsessing, thinking, what else? How can I fix this? How can I do that? And as we obsess, we use all of our emotional and mental energy. And so we feel burned out and tired. And then the roller coaster of emotions gets worse. And so we're like, I still want to find safety. I still want to find stability. And that obsession leads to something we call control. And control is where we go about either trying to control everybody else around us to try to stay safe, or we go inward and we go, man, if I was just blank, if I was just prettier, if I was smarter, if I was skinnier, if whatever, then I'd be okay, because everyone would see me as okay. And ultimately, neither fixing everybody else or trying to over control those things in my life are going to stop life from happening. And then I get burned out and I get tired. And then when I'm burned out and tired, I feel unstable emotionally, which scares me. And then I continue to move through this cycle where I'm constantly living in fear. And my primary motivation in life is fear-based. And that's a hard place to live. Like, when just think about being like a goldfish in a tank, like a fishbowl where everyone can see you, there's that stress all the time because you're living out of fear, where in reality, we want to try to break the fear cycle, and we want to start moving to a place of authentic living, which allows us to say, look, I live in a world that's going to give me some stresses. It's going to give me some struggles, but I can train myself how to be a person that lives in that world instead of being a person that has to avoid that world. There's a quote by Robert Frost. I love this quote that he gives, and it says, basically, the best way out is always through. And that's what I love about EMDR. That's what I love about exposure therapy. That's what I love about like this idea of wholeheartedness that Brené Brown talks about in her books, is that really it's about learning to live a wholehearted life. That's where we're going to find our freedom, instead of always living out of a place of fear.
Yeah. Oh, wow. No, but it's interesting you mentioned about burnout, because again, that's really common for trauma survivors, right? I mean, again, you know, we had an episode of this just recently about the fact that a lot of us will overwork. You know, we'll just work, do 70 odd hours a week, just because we're just in avoidance behavior, aren't we? We're trying to avoid what we're really feeling. And I actually believe that I've been carrying this through till this day. And it's about, and you're right. And it's about, you know, being present, and about practicing compassion and, you know, wholeheartedness. And I mean, what would be the first steps to this journey of self-realization for someone who hasn't even known that they've got trauma? You know, they're just probably working and just trying to avoid staying in silent. What would you recommend for somebody like that?
That's a good question. I'd recommend to anybody falls in that category of always being busy to pause for a minute, and if you can, try to take a place where you have to stay in silence with your own brain for 24, 48, 72 hours, and see what actually comes out in you.
Wow.
And most people realize pretty quickly that the internal story in their own head is a place that they don't like spending a lot of time. Because we live in a world that's like trying to teach us shame, trying to teach us that we're not enough. I mean, even look at the advertisements on your television. Everything is geared towards making you feel less than, so that you'll buy their products so that you can finally arrive. And when you add that to trauma, then we don't like spending a lot of time in our own minds. But then after that, okay, let's say we do say, okay, I know that that's me. I'm running away from things. I'm having a struggle right now. Yeah. I teach my clients to look at it from a very broad perspective first, and then we narrow down into certain practices. And the broad perspective is that the life that's worth living is a life that is seen from a growth mindset, where I'm allowed to make mistakes, I'm allowed to make my own choices, and I'm allowed to grow and learn as a result. And then we pursue a lifestyle of what we call connection. A lifestyle of connection to other people with authenticity and honesty and humility and accountability. A lifestyle of connection to something bigger than ourselves, purpose, God, other meaning. And then a lifestyle of connection to ourselves, where I can be comfortable connecting my heart and my mind and saying, this is my life. I'm okay with it. I'm a work in progress. These are the things that I'm really good at, and these are the things that I've got to work on, and I can own all of it. Yeah. And when I'm living that pursuit of connection 3 ways, higher power, self, others, that's a wholehearted life.
That's beautiful. Wow. What a great answer. I love that. And and again, you know, this is something which I feel that everybody has to try and understand what that means, and just to, like you said, just sit there and just go with your thoughts. Because I know, again, you know, a lot of people are quite scared of what comes up, because, you know, a lot of the time it's not going to be that great. But God, I think the power comes when you can actually accept those thoughts for what they are.
Right. And I think that's built into all of us in a certain way. You know, like we all love certain movies. We love the story of, the person who gets sent on a journey and they have to conquer the demon, and then they arrive back home with a new power. And like, we all relate to that because that's the part of us that feels that way about our own problems. And, I heard another, I'm sorry, I'm like Mr. Quote Guy today, but like, did I share another quote with you quickly?
We like quotes, don't worry.
Joseph Campbell, who is kind of like the originator of the hero's journey, he said, "In the cave that you most fear to enter lies the treasure that you most seek." And in a sense, that's being able to go into that place in our own mind is the cave. It's okay, I'm afraid of what I might find when I go into myself and actually look at what's there. But the truth is that for most of us, it's like the movie Kung Fu Panda with the dragon scroll. When he opens it up, all he sees is his own reflection, and he goes, "Oh, there is no secret ingredient." Like, we already have what it takes. Like, inside of us is everything that we need. It's just that we need permission. We need to give ourselves permission to unlock that part of ourselves and realize that we already have it. We just need to live with it instead of avoiding it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like untapping into, the hidden potential which we all have. But I know, because a lot of this at the moment, for a lot of trauma survivors, it's all being obviously, hidden by shame and guilt. Would you say shame and guilt are the two most kind of negative? What are they? Because again, I had this from a previous episode where they're not actually part of us, are they? They're these uninvited guests, that come into our lives, shame and guilt. And it's about kind of not allowing shame and guilt to obviously take over. But I mean, when, like, for example, I'm looking back at my days of when I was a bit troubled with shame and guilt, and anything that would come into my head would be, "Oh, you're not worthy, look at you, you're ugly, and you're worth nothing." And it's just awful, having to
absolutely
just having to listen to that. And I just think, like, I really understand a lot of listeners who might be listening to this talk, they're probably still a bit confused, thinking, how do I overcome these negative emotions?
That's a great question. I think when I look at the work that I do, I often say that it feels really complicated when you look at the details, but when you look at the roots, it always boils down to shame. And shame is this belief that there is something so wrong with me that if people saw it, they wouldn't love me. And so you start to see that shame is the unraveler of connection. It unravels us from connection to ourselves. It unravels us from connection to our bigger purposes and higher power. And it unravels us from connection to other people, because we're so afraid of not being loved, and so when I look at the difference between shame and guilt, I think shame is the one that's like, we all feel it, but shame is a defining emotion. It tells us that we are blank. We're not blank enough. Whereas guilt is more of that emotion that we don't like to feel it, but it's a moving emotion that says, "Oh, I did something that's not in line with my life or my values, and I better do something different." And so I encourage my clients to try to shift their shame into guilt, because guilt allows movement, whereas shame just keeps us paralyzed and stuck. And so when we start saying, okay, well, how do I overcome that then? How do I overcome shame? How do I manage my guilt differently? I look at, on a very base level, I talk about 3 C's of shame resiliency. And the first C is context. When I'm feeling shameful about something, I should look at the bigger picture. So like when I'm feeling like I'm the only one who has a problem with a substance, or I'm the only one who's ever experienced like childhood sexual abuse, or I'm the only one who's going through a divorce, if I go and look at the bigger picture, which is the context, I start to realize I'm not alone. Like, this is the world that we live in. What 1 in 3 women are going to experience sexual abuse before they're adults. Like, I'm not alone, So the first C is context. The second C is what Brene Brown calls courage. And she says courage is the ability to tell your story of who you are with your whole heart. And so I need to find places where I can speak the things that I feel like I can't speak. And if I can lean into that, if I can act with courage and tell that story, I can liberate myself and I can start to move again. And then the last C is compassion. Instead of meeting myself and others with judgment, that judgment of I'm not enough, or I'm stupid, or I'm dumb, or I'm fat, or whatever, it's more of like, can I start to meet myself and others with compassion, with love? Love is the greatest motivator in the world, even though shame would argue with that. And so if I can meet shame with love, then I can become resilient to it.
Wow, I love that. There's so much power in what you've just described there, because I just think that's so important for anybody to, first of all, accept what happened to them, right? And then to start to communicate it to people, to share their stories. And I guess this is why you got platforms like social media and, you know, the fact that you can self-publish now, you know, and just blog, just write it out, just go and share your story, get it out there. And
look at the power that you're having right now on your platform, because you're willing to put yourself out there.
Absolutely.
And it's as a direct result of your own life. Like you're a perfect example of that.
Yeah, we are. Same with you. We're both walking examples. And but I just think it's amazing, because I listen to Russell Brand a lot, and obviously, you know, he's had a real addictive history as well, and you know, he's adopted this 12-step process, which you know, again, there's mixed reviews about that. I don't know what your kind of views are about that, and if there's any other techniques that you would recommend for addiction survivors.
Yeah, for me, the 12-step principles, if you really look at the principles of the 12 steps, there's a lot, I believe there's a lot of truth inside of those principles, because it's really, you look at the first few steps and it's about wrestling with your idea of something bigger than yourself. And then the next steps are wrestling with yourself. And then the last few steps are wrestling with how you're going to make an impact on the world and in the context of other people. And so it kind of goes right in line with those kinds of lifestyle of connection I was talking about earlier. But to me, for overcoming addictions, it truly, for most people, comes down to shame resiliency. It's making peace with the demons that are in my closet that I felt like I'm going to have to keep there the rest of my life, and realizing that they don't have to be as scary as I thought they were once you really start to shine some light on them. Can I tell you a story? When I was a little kid, I lived in the basement of my house, and I had, like, I don't know how many of your listeners will have this, but I had a monster that lived in my basement, and the monster was a purple octopus that lived in the utility room, and I never actually saw the monster, but because it could only live in the dark, so every time I flipped on the lights, I never saw it, but I knew it was there, and really the point of that is I think it's kind of a metaphor for our lives in a way where monsters are a lot scarier in the dark. But when we have the courage to turn on the lights, they retreat to the corners, and they don't necessarily need to impact us the way that we think they will. In fact, you think about our pain and suffering, most of us, our greatest suffering comes from the fear of the unknown more than the actual trauma we've experienced. And that's actually really encouraging to me in some ways, because that means I have control over a lot of my suffering. Like, I have the ability to actually make a better life for myself, regardless of what happened to me in my life.
Yeah, it's just that one decision that you have to make, the one decision which is going to change your life.
Yeah, but it's a decision that is hard to make, and it's one that has to be made over and over again because it's scary, you know.
It is. This is why, I mean, you know, I have no idea what the percentage of, let's say, you know, drug or alcohol addiction. I have no idea the percentage of people that actually go back to, you know, to their old behaviors, because that, you know, they've just not been ready. But I'm sure it takes many attempts for anybody to quit drugs and alcohol, even smoking. I guess addiction doesn't stop there. Addiction to technology, to phones, to work,
you name it,
to sex, which is what you deal with, of course.
Yep.
Wow, it does. Addiction just goes like yeah, beyond. I don't know, but what are you finding at the moment? What are people most addicted to who come to you?
That's a good question. I think all of us could probably pick our favorite, right? Like you know, like we all have our own favorites. I think the ones that I see the most of are right now is a lot of media addiction. Social media is a big one. Video games. I think people are addicted to energy drinks, caffeine, and things like that. Okay. And then for me, my world that I spend a lot of my time in is around sex addiction, where, you know, that's a little bit of a different one, but really all of them are to the same end, which is I'm trying to cope emotionally with what I'm afraid my life is, and I'm too afraid to confront what's causing the problem. So I'm looking for a way to either numb out or find excitement or to feel alive again. And, you know, so my wife drinks Diet Coke, and I know what kind of a day it's been when she's like on her 4th Diet Coke for the day, right? Like, you know, like, because it's the same process as like me if I wanted to go smoke marijuana, or if my friend wanted to go do alcohol or whatever. It's all the same process. It's the acting out part of it is just the flower of a plant that's got the deeper roots into shame.
Interesting. So I suppose, you know, for somebody who is addicted to, you know, media, let's just say they're about to pick up their phone. It's just about, again, having that self-awareness, thinking, right, okay, why do I need to pick up my phone again? What is it that I'm checking? Can I not be doing something else right now? So do you think that's all it takes, just that moment to just stop and think?
Yeah, I think we talk about mindfulness all the time, which is also another really big tool for overcoming trauma. And, you know, as I was at the car shop waiting for my tires to be fixed the other day, and somebody sat down next to me, and I thought to myself, I had to start up a conversation with them. And then I felt stressed about it. So I reached into my phone and started getting on my Facebook page. And then I paused for a second. I'm like, why am I doing this? And but the truth is that I was avoiding the discomfort of having to talk to somebody. So I'm like, okay, I'll put my phone away. Wow. I started talking to them. And then of course they looked at me like I was crazy and went back to their phone. So
who's this weirdo?
they were feeling the same way, you know. So
that is so funny. I suppose with the lockdown, it's made us more antisocial. Where we're all like that, aren't we? In the queues, really, we should be socializing with each other. Turn around and say hi.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my goodness! But yeah, I was at the bank the other day, and yeah, I think I was on the phone and I just put my mask down a little bit, and oh God, the amount of grief that I got from this woman behind me. Oh, God, I'm so sorry. I put my mask down so I could breathe for 1 second. Put it back up.
Yeah, that's funny.
Oh, God.
And the thing is, she missed out on the beauty of being able to enjoy your smile instead of judging you, right?
I know, right? Judge. Oh my God, I think that's another episode. Judgmentalness, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Oh no. Oh wow, honestly, you've got so much knowledge, and I just think you've come such a long way. And so tell us you know, what you're doing out there now and how my listeners can find you.
Sure. Yeah. So just a couple of quick things. I do a podcast with my brother, who's also a therapist, called Therapy Brothers, and you can find that on all the podcast places. And then you can also just go to lovestrong.com, and we have all of the information that we have about our YouTube videos and everything there. So
that's beautiful. Yeah. And I'll also add some links on the description as well, so that you can all directly link onto Tyler. And are you offering your services to the nation as well?
Yeah, so we have 2 practices. We have one that's local for in-person clients, and then we also do online coaching as well.
Oh, perfect. That's great. And, you know, I think it's always beneficial now, the fact that we're living in, you know, a very technology savvy culture where anybody can hit you up, you know, if they're down in Australia, hit you up in the States, they want you as a therapist. It's amazing, isn't it? Technology.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah. And look, the fact we're on here today, otherwise, we probably wouldn't have had this talk if it wasn't for, you know, Zoom and the lockdown, right?
Yeah.
Lockdown's changed everything. Wow.
Yeah.
But no, thank you so much. It's been such an honor to have you on. And yeah, so just a few questions before we close off for today, if that's all right.
Okay.
Excellent. So first of all is what is your biggest regret to date?
My biggest regret to date? I wish I would have learned about how to speak the truth of who I was 20 years earlier than I did. Wow. Because it would have allowed me to have a lot more deep connection with some of the people that I consider my best friends that still never actually really knew who I was.
Wow, that's powerful. That is, yeah. And so in terms of your future, what do you have planned in the future for yourself and your career and your profession?
That's a good question. My whole goal is to try to basically, everything that I've been through is only as good as my ability to help somebody else who's been in the same situation. So my goal is to continue to build the platform of Love Strong so that people can learn how to climb out of the dark and step into the light a little more fully with what we call the wholehearted lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And then I'm a family man, and so I like spending time with my daughters, and I would just want to be the best father that I can be, make sure my daughters know I love them and that I'm there to help them learn and grow.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. And there's just this one quote which I've been contemplating recently, and I wanted to get your professional view on it. What do you think of that quote, which goes, "If you're not growing, you're dying"?
I love it. I love the quote. I mean, think about what we have here. We have these so many years, most of us about 74 years to live in this world. And the way that I kind of view my own life is that I get to be a work in progress until I die. I'll never reach perfection. I'll never reach the final gate. And that's beautiful, that there's an unlimited potential for us to grow. So I fully endorse the quote. I like the quote.
Oh, excellent. I love that. Yeah, I've always liked it too. And then I had a bit of a contradictory view on it, saying, no, it's not about growing all the time. It's about staying present too, right? And I'm thinking, okay, yeah, I get that. It's about staying present. But
isn't that's the paradox though, is that even learning to stay present is part of the growing process.
Well, yeah, right.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm glad to ask you that. Thank you so much. And so amazing. So I will obviously be publishing this talk on all the major podcasts. So you'll be able to find this talk on YouTube as well. And yeah, it's just been an absolute honor to have you on, Tyler. And I wish you all the success for your podcast and your practice and also your future.
You as well. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. God bless.
Yeah.